Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he ruled from his ivory tower. At 35, he commanded a business empire worth $8 billion, owned properties across 6 continents, and could buy anything his heart desired. Yet as he stared at the glittering lights below, an emptiness gnawed at him that no amount of money had ever been able to fill. His reflection in the glass showed a man who appeared to have everything. Perfectly tailored suits, a jawline that graced magazine covers, and eyes that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions. But behind those eyes lay a profound loneliness that had been his constant companion since childhood. Raised by nannies in boarding schools while his parents pursued their own fortunes, Marcus had learned early that relationships were transactions and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The buzzing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Another invitation to another charity gala where wealthy people would write checks to feel good about themselves while changing nothing substantial. He declined with a curt message to his assistant. These events had become meaningless rituals, performances where everyone played their assigned roles in the theater of high society. His mansion in the exclusive Beacon Hill district was a testament to his success. 23 rooms filled with priceless art and antiques, gardens designed by award-winning landscapers, and every modern convenience imaginable. Yet Marcus often found himself eating dinner alone in the vast dining room, the silence broken only by the ticking of an antique clock that had cost more than most people earned in a year. The household staff moved through the mansion like ghosts, efficient and invisible. Marcus preferred it that way. He paid them well to maintain his privacy and keep his world running smoothly without requiring his attention or emotional investment. They had contracts, not relationships. Boundaries were clear, expectations understood, and everyone stayed in their designated roles. It was during one of these solitary evenings that Marcus first became aware of Elena Rodriguez, though he didn't know her name then. She was simply the woman who cleaned the floors late at night when he was supposed to be asleep. Sometimes, when insomnia kept him pacing the halls, he would catch glimpses of her moving quietly through the rooms, her presence so subtle he might have imagined her. Elena worked for the cleaning service that maintained his home. She arrived after 9 in the evening and left before dawn, ensuring that Marcus never had to be inconvenienced by the sight of someone actually doing the work that kept his world pristine. She was part of the invisible army of people who made his comfortable life possible while remaining completely separate from it. What Marcus didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez was fighting a battle that would have broken most people. At 28, she was a single mother raising her 4-year-old son Diego while working 3 jobs to keep them afloat. The cleaning job at the Wellington mansion was her most lucrative position, paying enough to cover their small apartment's rent, but it meant working from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. Then, rushing home to get Diego ready for daycare before heading to her second job at a local diner. Elena had immigrated from Mexico 5 years earlier with dreams of providing her unborn child with opportunities she had never had. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had been studying to become a nurse before circumstances forced her to prioritize survival over education. Her hands, which should have been learning to heal, instead scrubbed floors and cleaned toilets for people who earned more in a day than she would see in a lifetime. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her nights in a mansion worth more than $30 million while she and Diego shared a 1-bedroom apartment where the heat didn't always work. She knew every inch of Marcus Wellington's home better than he did. She had polished the marble floors of his library where books worth thousands of dollars sat unread on custom shelves. She had cleaned the windows of his art room where paintings by masters hung on walls that rarely saw visitors. Diego was Elena's entire world. Every sacrifice, every exhausting night, every moment of doubt was worth it for his bright smile and infectious laughter. At 4 years old, he was already showing signs of inheriting his mother's intelligence and determination. He would sit quietly in the corner of their apartment, drawing pictures while Elena caught a few hours of sleep between jobs, somehow understanding even at his young age that his mother needed him to be strong. The daycare where Diego spent his days was run by Mrs. Garcia, an elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to him. She charged Elena less than her usual rate because she understood the struggle of raising a child alone. Diego loved Mrs. Garcia's stories and the way she would teach him Spanish words that connected him to his heritage. But, lately, even Mrs. Garcia had been worried about Elena's health. Working 16-hour days was taking its toll on Elena's body. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. Her hands, once soft and graceful, were now rough from constant cleaning, and a persistent cough had developed that she couldn't shake. But she couldn't afford to be sick, couldn't afford to take time off, couldn't afford to be anything other than strong. The Wellington mansion had become her nighttime sanctuary in an unexpected way. While she worked, she could imagine what it would be like to live without constant worry about money. She would sometimes pause in the library and run her fingers along the spines of books she longed to read. In the kitchen, she would admire appliances that cost more than she earned in months. It wasn't envy she felt, but rather a quiet wonder at how differently people could live in the same world. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his routine of board meetings, business dinners, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees across his companies. His days were scheduled in 15-minute increments, every moment accounted for and optimized for maximum productivity. He made decisions that moved markets and influenced industries, yet he felt increasingly disconnected from any sense of purpose or meaning. His closest relationships, if they could be called that, were with other wealthy executives who spoke the same language of profit margins and market dominance. They socialized at exclusive clubs, vacationed on private islands, and married within their social circle to maintain their dynasties. Love was a concept that seemed foreign to their world, where prenuptial agreements and strategic alliances mattered more than emotional connection. The contrast between Marcus and Elena's worlds couldn't have been more stark. He lived in a realm where problems were solved with money and power, where comfort was assumed, and where isolation was a choice rather than a circumstance. She existed in a reality where every day brought new challenges to overcome, where love was demonstrated through sacrifice, and where hope was the only luxury she could afford. Yet both were searching for something neither could name. Marcus sought authenticity in a world built on facades, while Elena dreamed of security in a life defined by uncertainty. Both were strong in their own ways, both were lonely despite being surrounded by people, and both were about to discover that the walls separating their worlds were far more fragile than either had ever imagined. The stage was set for an encounter that would change everything, though neither Marcus nor Elena could have predicted how their paths would soon intersect in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about life, love, and what truly mattered. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest moments, and sometimes the people we need most are the ones we've never really seen. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the October evening into a symphony of water against windows and thunder rolling across the Massachusetts sky. Marcus sat in his study, trying to focus on quarterly reports that blurred together after hours of reading. The numbers told a story of continued success, but the satisfaction he once felt from growing profits had long since faded into mechanical routine. A particularly loud clap of thunder made him look up from his laptop. The storm was intensifying, and, through his window, he could see trees bending against the wind. It was the kind of weather that made him grateful for his secure, climate-controlled environment. He poured himself a glass of aged whiskey and settled back into his leather chair, letting the sound of rain replace the silence that usually filled his evenings. Elena had arrived at work that night already soaked to the skin. The bus had broken down 6 blocks from the mansion, and she had run through the downpour with her cleaning supplies clutched against her chest. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had called in sick with the flu, leaving Elena to handle the entire mansion alone. Normally, this would mean finishing by 4 in the morning instead of 2, but tonight it seemed like an impossible task. Diego had been running a fever when she left him with Mrs. Garcia. The elderly babysitter had assured Elena that it was just a common cold, but leaving her sick child to clean someone else's home felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about motherhood. She had kissed his warm forehead and promised to bring him soup in the morning, knowing she would have barely enough energy to stand after working all night. As Elena moved through the mansion's ground floor, her exhaustion was overwhelming. The fever she had dismissed as stress was actually the same flu that had sidelined her supervisor. Her hands shook as she cleaned, and twice she had to stop and lean against the wall to keep from falling. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest in her body, but she pushed forward because stopping wasn't an option. Marcus had intended to go to bed early, but the combination of whiskey and storm watching had kept him in his study well past midnight. He was considering another drink when he heard something that shouldn't have been there. It was a small sound, almost lost in the storm's noise, but it didn't belong to the usual symphony of his perfectly ordered home. Curiosity overcame his usual indifference to household matters. He set down his glass and moved quietly toward the main staircase, following the sound. As he descended, he could hear it more clearly. It was breathing, but labored and irregular, coming from the direction of the formal dining room. Elena had been cleaning the crystal chandelier when the fever finally overwhelmed her. The room began to spin, and she felt her knees give out. She managed to lower herself to the floor rather than falling completely, but the world around her was tilting dangerously. Her phone was in her bag across the room, but it might as well have been on the moon. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the waves of nausea and dizziness. That was when she heard footsteps approaching, and panic shot through her fevered consciousness. No one was supposed to see her like this. She was supposed to be invisible, efficient, and professional. Being discovered sick and collapsed on the floor would surely cost her the job she desperately needed. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. Marcus rounded the corner expecting to find a window left open or perhaps a piece of equipment malfunctioning. Instead, he found a young woman lying on his dining room floor, struggling to breathe. For a moment, he stood frozen, processing this unexpected intrusion into his carefully controlled world. Then, training from long ago first aid courses kicked in, and he moved toward her. Elena looked up to see Marcus Wellington himself approaching, and mortification flooded through her already overwhelmed system. She attempted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but only managed to whisper "I'm sorry" before another wave of dizziness crashed over her. Marcus knelt beside her, and, for the first time in years, he truly saw another human being. Not as an employee or a transaction or a social obligation, but as a person in distress who needed help. Elena's dark hair was damp with perspiration, her brown eyes bright with fever, and her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up from the floor. "Don't try to get up," Marcus said, his voice gentler than he had used in years. "You're burning up with fever. What's your name?" "Elena," she whispered, then added quickly, "I can work. I just need a minute. Please don't fire me." The desperation in her voice hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was someone so afraid of losing work that she was willing to clean floors while seriously ill. He realized he had never known the names of most of the people who maintained his home, had never considered what their lives were like outside these walls, had never thought about the human cost of his comfortable invisibility. "I'm going to call an ambulance," Marcus said, reaching for his phone. "No." Elena's response was immediate and panicked. "Please, no hospital. I can't afford it. And, my son, he's sick too. I have to get home to him." For the first time, Marcus learned that this woman had a child, had a life beyond his floors and windows, had responsibilities and fears and dreams that had nothing to do with his world. The revelation was startling in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Instead of calling 911, Marcus made a decision that surprised him. He carefully helped Elena to the living room couch, brought her water and a cool cloth for her forehead, and asked Mrs. Patterson's emergency contact information so he could arrange for her proper care. But Elena's concern wasn't for herself, it was entirely focused on getting home to Diego. Through her fever, Elena explained that her 4-year-old son was also sick, that she was his only caretaker, and that Mrs. Garcia couldn't handle a sick child overnight. She spoke about Diego with such obvious love and worry that Marcus found himself moved in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood. This woman, who had nothing by his standards, was rich in something he had never possessed, the kind of love that put another person's needs above her own survival. Marcus did something completely out of character. He offered to drive Elena home himself. She protested weakly, insisting she could take the bus, but he was already getting his coat and car keys. Something about her fierce protectiveness of her child reminded him of the mother he had barely known, and something about her dignity in the face of crisis commanded his respect. The drive to Elena's apartment took them through neighborhoods Marcus had never seen despite living in Boston for over a decade. They passed laundromats and corner stores, small restaurants with neon signs in multiple languages, and apartment buildings that housed entire families in spaces smaller than his walk-in closet. Elena sat quietly in the passenger seat, directing him through streets that seemed to belong to a different city entirely. Elena's apartment building was a worn structure where the elevator didn't work and the hallway lights flickered intermittently. Marcus followed her up 3 flights of stairs, carrying her cleaning supplies while she leaned heavily on the railing. With each step, he became more aware of the gap between his world and hers, not just in terms of money, but in terms of daily realities he had never had to consider. Mrs. Garcia met them at the door, her weathered face creased with worry. She had been caring for Diego, who was indeed running a high fever and asking constantly for his mother. The elderly woman looked surprised to see the well-dressed man accompanying Elena, but her focus remained on getting both patients the care they needed. It was when Marcus saw Diego for the first time that something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what mattered. The 4-year-old was small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and a smile that persisted despite his illness. Even feeling terrible, Diego politely thanked Marcus for bringing his mother home and offered to share his favorite stuffed animal to make the stranger feel welcome. The small apartment told a story of love making up for material lack. The walls were covered with Diego's artwork, the furniture was mismatched but clean, and everything was organized with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to lose or replace anything. Books from the library were stacked neatly on a small table, and photos of Diego and Elena together showed glimpses of happiness stolen from difficult circumstances. Marcus watched Elena transform the moment she saw her son. Despite her fever and exhaustion, she became completely focused on Diego's comfort and care. She checked his temperature, gave him medicine, and held him while singing a Spanish lullaby that seemed to ease his distress. Her love was so pure and fierce that Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a space that had been sealed shut for decades. That night, instead of returning to his empty mansion, Marcus found himself staying to help. He made simple soup from ingredients in Elena's tiny kitchen, cleaned up while she rested with Diego, and watched the small family care for each other with a tenderness that made his throat tight with unexpected emotion. As dawn approached and both Elena and Diego slept peacefully for the first time in days, Marcus sat in a second-hand chair and looked around the small apartment. Everything he saw spoke of resilience, love, and dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have defeated many people. Elena worked 3 jobs to provide for her son while maintaining her pride and raising him with values that seemed foreign to the wealthy world Marcus knew. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus understood what he had been missing. It wasn't just companionship or even love, though he craved both. It was purpose, connection, and the kind of meaning that came from caring about someone else's well-being more than your own comfort. Watching Elena with Diego had shown him a different way of living, one where wealth was measured in moments of tenderness rather than quarterly profits. As he quietly prepared to leave, Diego woke up and asked in a small, hoarse voice if Marcus would come back to visit. The question was asked with the innocent hope of a child who had no understanding of social barriers or class differences. To Diego, Marcus was simply a kind man who had helped his mother and made good soup. Standing in the doorway of that tiny apartment, looking back at the sleeping woman who had worked herself sick to provide for her child, Marcus made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. He didn't understand yet what form that change would take, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't return to his old life and pretend this night had never happened. Sometimes the most profound revelations come not through grand gestures or dramatic events, but through simple acts of human kindness that reveal what we've been missing all along. For Marcus, that revelation had arrived in the form of a sick woman on his dining room floor and her son's innocent question about friendship across impossible divides. Marcus couldn't sleep when he returned to his mansion that morning. The contrast between Elena's small apartment and his sprawling estate felt more jarring than ever before. He wandered through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too empty, too cold despite their perfect temperature control. Every polished surface reminded him of Elena's hands cleaning them while fighting exhaustion and illness. He found himself in his kitchen, staring at appliances that cost more than most people earn in months, thinking about how Elena had made nutritious soup from basic ingredients in her tiny space. His refrigerator, usually stocked by his housekeeper with gourmet items he rarely touched, seemed absurd when compared to Elena's carefully budgeted groceries. The next few days passed differently for Marcus than any had in years. He couldn't focus on his usual routine of meetings and decisions. Instead, he found himself researching things he had never considered: the cost of childcare, the challenges faced by single mothers, the wages paid to cleaning staff. Each search revealed layers of difficulty in lives he had never bothered to understand. Elena spent those same days recovering from the flu while caring for Diego. Mrs. Garcia had insisted on helping despite her own age and limited resources, bringing homemade remedies and taking care of Diego when Elena's fever spiked. The elderly woman had also shared something that kept Elena awake despite her exhaustion. Marcus Wellington had left an envelope with enough money to cover Elena's lost wages and Diego's medical care, along with a note saying simply, "Please focus on getting well." The gesture confused Elena more than it comforted her. In her experience, wealthy people didn't notice service workers beyond their functions, and they certainly didn't care about their personal struggles. She had worked for rich families before, and, while some were kind in a distant way, none had ever seen her as fully human. Marcus's unexpected concern felt dangerous to her carefully built emotional walls. When Elena returned to work a week later, she expected everything to go back to normal. She would clean the mansion at night, maintain her professional invisibility, and pretend the strange evening of her collapse had never happened. But normal was no longer possible because Marcus was waiting for her. "Elena," he said when she arrived, using her name for the second time in their brief acquaintance. "I was hoping we could talk." She stood in his doorway, clutching her cleaning supplies like a shield, unsure of what this conversation might mean for her employment. Rich people, in her experience, didn't talk with their housekeeping staff unless something was wrong. "Is Diego feeling better?" Marcus asked, and the genuine concern in his voice caught her completely off guard. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking." Elena's voice was carefully neutral, professional. She had learned to keep her emotions hidden when dealing with employers. "And you? Are you fully recovered?" The question seemed to require more than a simple yes or no. Marcus was looking at her as if her answer actually mattered to him, as if she were a person whose well-being could affect his day. It was an attention Elena wasn't sure how to handle. "I'm fine, sir. I'm ready to work." Marcus gestured toward the living room where he had helped her that stormy night. "Would you please sit down? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." Elena's heart pounded as she followed him, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he was going to fire her after all. Maybe his initial kindness had been temporary, and now he regretted getting involved with his employees' problems. Maybe this was how rich people delivered bad news, with courtesy that softened the blow. "I've been thinking about what happened," Marcus began, settling into a chair across from her. "About your situation, about Diego, about how hard you worked to take care of him." Elena remained silent, waiting for the inevitable dismissal. "I want to help," Marcus continued. "Not just with one emergency, but in a more substantial way. I'd like to offer you a different position." The words hung in the air between them. Elena had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially from people who had power over her livelihood. "What kind of position?" she asked carefully. "House manager," Marcus said. "You would oversee the maintenance and organization of the property, manage the other staff, handle the details of running the household. It would be a daytime position, Monday through Friday, with a salary that would allow you to quit your other jobs." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. A legitimate position with regular hours and decent pay seemed like a fantasy after years of scraping together multiple part-time jobs. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and suspicion. Marcus had been asking himself the same question for days. The honest answer was complex and not entirely clear even to him. Watching Elena care for Diego had awakened something in him that he didn't fully understand. Her fierce love and quiet strength had shown him a way of living that his money and power had never provided access to. "Because you're intelligent, hardworking, and you understand how to manage complex situations under pressure," he said, which was true but not complete. "And because Diego deserves to have his mother home at night." The mention of her son broke through Elena's defenses more effectively than any amount of money could have. The idea that Diego could go to bed with his mother there to read him stories and wake up to find her making breakfast seemed too wonderful to believe. "I don't have experience managing other people," Elena said, though she wanted the job more than she had wanted anything in years. You manage 3 jobs, a household, and a 4-year-old child, Marcus replied. I think you can handle supervising a cleaning crew and coordinating maintenance schedules. The offer was everything Elena had dreamed of: stability, better pay, normal hours, and the chance to be present for more of Diego's childhood. But accepting it felt dangerous for reasons she couldn't articulate. It would mean entering Marcus's world more fully, spending days in his presence instead of invisible nights, becoming someone he interacted with regularly rather than someone he could ignore. Can I think about it? Elena asked, though her heart had already decided. Of course. Take all the time you need. That evening, Elena discussed the offer with Mrs. Garcia while Diego played with his blocks nearby. The older woman listened carefully, asked practical questions about salary and benefits, and then sat quietly for a long moment. Mija, Mrs. Garcia finally said, using the affectionate term she had adopted for Elena, sometimes when good things come into our lives, we think we don't deserve them. But maybe this man sees what I see when I look at you. What do you see? Elena asked. A woman who would do anything for her child. A woman who works harder than anyone should have to work. A woman who deserves a chance to build something better. That night, as Diego slept beside her in their narrow bed, Elena allowed herself to imagine a different life. She pictured picking Diego up from daycare at a reasonable hour, helping him with homework at their own kitchen table, being present for bedtime stories and morning conversations. She imagined having enough money to buy him new clothes instead of constant trips to thrift stores, being able to take him to the doctor without calculating the cost, maybe even saving enough for a small vacation. But, alongside the dreams came fears. What if Marcus's kindness was temporary? What if she disappointed him as an employee and ended up with no job at all? What if working closely with him led to complications she wasn't equipped to handle? Elena had learned to be suspicious of men who seemed too good to be true, especially when they held power over her security. The next morning, Elena made her decision based not on her fears but on what would be best for Diego. She called Marcus and accepted the position, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Marcus felt a relief he hadn't expected when Elena agreed to take the job. Over the past week, he had found himself hoping she would say yes for reasons that went beyond needing a good house manager. Having her in his daily environment, being able to ensure she and Diego were taken care of, somehow felt like the beginning of something important, though he couldn't name what that might be. Elena's first day as house manager was both exciting and intimidating. Marcus showed her through the mansion room by room, explaining systems and schedules, introducing her to the staff members she would coordinate. Elena found herself seeing the house differently now that she was responsible for its operation rather than just its cleanliness. As they walked through his home office, Elena noticed the books on business and finance mixed with others on art and history. She commented on a volume of poetry by Pablo Neruda, mentioning that she had read it in Spanish during her own studies. Marcus stopped and looked at her with surprise. You're familiar with Neruda? I was studying literature before. Elena paused, not wanting to share too much personal history. Before Diego came along. This revelation added another layer to Marcus's growing understanding of who Elena was beyond her circumstances. She wasn't just a hard-working single mother, she was an educated woman who had been forced to set aside her own dreams to survive and provide for her child. As the days passed, Marcus found himself looking forward to his interactions with Elena in ways that had nothing to do with household management. She brought a perspective to his isolated world that he hadn't realized he was missing. Her insights were sharp, her problem-solving abilities impressive, and her quiet dignity in all situations commanded his growing respect. Elena, for her part, began to see Marcus as more complex than the wealthy archetype she had expected. He was lonely in a way that money couldn't fix, genuinely curious about her opinions, and surprisingly thoughtful about Diego's needs. When she mentioned that Diego loved books but they couldn't afford many, Marcus quietly arranged for the mansion's library to be stocked with children's literature that Elena could borrow freely. The relationship between them began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Conversations that started about household business would drift into discussions of books they had both read, places they had dreamed of visiting, or ideas about what made life meaningful. Elena found herself looking forward to these moments of connection, while Marcus discovered that his daily routine had begun to revolve around times when he might encounter Elena. Neither of them acknowledged what was happening, but something was clearly changing. The invisible lines that separated their worlds were being crossed in small daily increments, each conversation and shared moment weaving connections that neither had planned but both were beginning to treasure. Diego, oblivious to the complex emotions swirling around the adults in his life, simply enjoyed having his mother home for dinner and bedtime stories. His world had become safer and more stable, and he showed his appreciation through art projects he made for Elena and endless questions about the mansion where she now worked during the day. As autumn deepened into winter, both Marcus and Elena began to realize that what had started as a business arrangement was evolving into something neither had expected but both found themselves hoping might continue to grow. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Boston in snow that transformed the city into something magical yet challenging for those without adequate resources to stay warm. Marcus watched from his heated mansion as Elena navigated the parking area, her worn coat insufficient protection against the bitter wind. The sight bothered him more than it should have, and he found himself making mental notes to address practical concerns that had never occurred to him before. Elena's new position had brought stability to her life in ways she was still learning to appreciate. Diego now attended a better daycare program that she could afford, and their tiny apartment felt less cramped when she wasn't falling into bed exhausted every night. But the most unexpected change was how she looked forward to her workdays in a way she never had before. The mansion had become a place of discovery rather than just employment. Marcus had given her access to his library, and she spent lunch breaks reading books she had dreamed of owning. Their conversations had evolved beyond work logistics into discussions about literature, world events, and philosophies that Elena had thought about but rarely had the opportunity to explore with anyone else. Diego had begun asking questions about Elena's work that revealed his sharp intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond their neighborhood. When Elena mentioned the mansion's library, Diego asked if there were books about dinosaurs. When she described the art collection, he wanted to know if he could draw pictures that good someday. His innocent questions made Elena realize how much larger the world could be for him with the right opportunities. It was during a particularly heavy snowstorm in December that the careful boundaries between Marcus and Elena began to shift more dramatically. Elena had arrived at work to find that the heating system in the east wing had malfunctioned, and the repair crew couldn't reach the mansion due to road conditions. Instead of dismissing her for the day, Marcus suggested they work together to address the immediate problem and protect the valuable items in the affected rooms. Working side by side to move artwork and furniture away from potentially freezing areas, Marcus and Elena found themselves in closer physical proximity than their usual professional interactions allowed. There were moments when their hands would brush as they lifted items together, when Marcus would steady Elena as she reached for high shelves, when their eyes would meet and hold for a few seconds longer than necessary. The crisis passed, the heating was restored, and the mansion returned to its normal temperature. But something had shifted between them that couldn't be reversed. They had seen each other as partners solving a problem together rather than employer and employee maintaining appropriate distance. That evening, as Elena prepared to leave work, Marcus did something unprecedented. He invited her to stay for dinner. "The roads are still dangerous," he said, though they both knew the main routes had been cleared hours earlier. "And I was about to heat up leftovers that are too much for one person." Elena knew she should decline. Every instinct developed through years of navigating complex power dynamics told her that sharing a meal would blur lines that should remain clear. But the alternative was returning to her cold apartment alone while Diego spent the evening at Mrs. Garcia's house, and the prospect of a warm meal in comfortable surroundings felt too appealing to refuse. Dinner was an education for both of them. Marcus learned that Elena had opinions about art, politics, and social issues that were informed and passionate. She spoke about immigration policy with the perspective of someone who had lived its realities, about economic inequality with the insight of someone who understood both sides, and about family dynamics with the wisdom of someone who had created love from nothing. Elena discovered that Marcus was more than the distant wealthy figure she had imagined. He listened to her perspectives without dismissing them, asked questions that showed genuine curiosity about her experiences, and revealed his own uncertainties about the meaning and purpose of his privileged life. When he spoke about his childhood loneliness and adult isolation, Elena recognized the pain. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in complete silence. Sometimes a single glance through a window can shatter every wall we've built around our hearts. Sometimes the people we overlook every day are the very ones who hold the keys to our salvation. What would you do if you discovered that the person who cleaned your floors, who you barely noticed, who lived in the shadows of your grand mansion, was actually the strongest person you'd ever encountered? What if their quiet strength, their unwavering love for their child, and their dignity in the face of impossible circumstances suddenly made your billions feel worthless? This is the story of Marcus Wellington, a man who had everything money could buy but nothing that truly mattered. And this is the story of Elena Rodriguez, a woman who had nothing the world valued but possessed everything that actually counts. One rainy evening, one unexpected moment, one decision to truly see another human being would change both their lives forever. Because sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin not with grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but with the simple act of recognizing the worth of someone the world has taught us to ignore. What happens when two people from completely different worlds realize they need each other more than they ever imagined? What happens when love breaks down every barrier society has built between the wealthy and the forgotten? This is that story.